Shavua Tov. Was the book of Genesis, of Breishit, written to be a speech to be delivered at the United Nations? It would seem that way from the very first Rashi. Rashi, in his commentary, quotes Rav Yitzchak, one of the Talmudic sages, who says that the Torah should have begun with the first commandment. After all, if the Torah is a book of commandments and rules, therefore it should start with commandments and rules and not with stories. It should have started with the first commandment, which was the commandment of the sanctification of the new moon, which we get to only in the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. So the question is, why did it begin with the creation of the world? And so Rabbi Yitzchak gives an answer, a geopolitical answer. He quotes a verse from the Psalms, Koach ma'asav higid le'amo, latet lehem nachalat goyim. The strength of his actions he told to his people in order to give them the inheritance of the nations. And then Rabbi Yitzchak explains how this verse is relevant, that if the nations of the world would come and claim that the Jews do not have a right to Palestine, to put it in modern terminology, then they should say, well, God created the whole world, and he gave the lands to whom he saw fit, and he gave it to them and took it away from them and gave it to us, and therefore you cannot argue, because we are here by divine right. Which is basically a speech to the United Nations. And the question is that the real purpose of the book of Genesis? I mean, I could think of a lot of great reasons why there should be the story of the creation of the world. So we should know how things came into existence. I'm sure everybody is curious about that. And furthermore, we learn about the patriarchs and the matriarchs and the birth of our people, the stories that are part of our very being. That's not important. We just needed to skip straight to Parashat Bo, to the book of Exodus, and start with the first commandment. Is that what this is supposed to be about? And second of all, if the purpose is simply to give us some kind of a valid argument to be used in that United Nations speech, then we only need the first chapter of the book of Genesis, which describes the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of God resting. And after that, we don't need the rest of the stories, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, the patriarch. We don't need all that. So what is it there for? Is Rabbi Yitzchak really saying that the book of Genesis in its entirety is a United Nations speech? Doesn't seem very likely. Let's explore this a little bit further. An interesting side point is that in the order of creation, the last thing created was humankind. Adam and Eve were the last things created, and this, the rabbis say, is to teach us a lesson. What is the lesson? That a person should say that the entire world was created for me. In other words, the world is our potential. And, you know, there's a prayer that's recited on Yom Kippur, the service, the avodah, which describes how the entire meal had been prepared. It's talking about the creation of the world, that the meal and the feast had been prepared, but there was nobody to eat it, nobody to participate, and therefore God created man to participate in the feast. In other words, the world was created for man to use. Now, lest man think, well, since the world is created for me, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want. The answer is he should also remember at the same time that a mosquito was created before him. A fly, a worm, all of the supposedly lower forms of life were created before man. So man should have a little humility. Humility does not mean that I think I'm nothing. Humility means that I know exactly my potential and my responsibilities, and I fulfill them faithfully. The most humble person in the history of the universe was Moshe. Moshe Anav Mikol Adam, the most humble of all people. He didn't know that he was the king, that he was the leader. He certainly did. But he didn't think that that made him special above anybody else. All it meant was he had a job to do, and he did it faithfully as any human being has ever done any job. And that is the definition of humility. So therefore we are taught that the world is created for us to do a job. It is not for us to be rulers of, but rather it is for us to be custodians of, and to use those gifts that we were given for the good. That's a little bit on the side, but we should also take from there an important lesson, that is, well, if the world was created for me, that means that each individual, which we feel, we know this, takes in life through their own two eyes. And everything that happens, we filter through our own mind, our own emotions. Really, we have a lonely existence together with lots of other people who are having a lonely existence, and together we can create something beautiful. But we each take in the world uniquely, and that is also an example of how the world was created for me. The world that I am born into was created for me, but which also carries with it a responsibility for each other. Because you know what? If the world was created for me, well then it was also created for the other. And I have to be protective of the other person's world as well. So there is also a lesson to be had there. But let's take a look at the way that the world was created, because this will guide us into understanding what Rav Yitzchak was truly saying. You see, the world was created not by bulldozers and not by chemical experiments and procedures. Rather, the Torah tells us quite straightforward. The world was created through speech. The world was created by 10 utterances. God said, "Let there be light." God said, let there be a separation between the upper waters and the lower waters. God said, "Let the land bring forth fruits and trees and wildlife," and all of these things. 10 times you have God speaking. It's actually 9, but the first word itself, Breishit, that God created the world, that is an utterance as well. Why the power of speech to create the world? Why not the power of physics, which is what we normally, scientists, will try to measure and assume. Scientists don't see speech in creation, but the Torah certainly does. So what is the Torah teaching us? Finally, the very first verse of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is a verse which is potentially misinterpreted and could even sound like some kind of a justification for paganism. How so? Well, when the Greek king of Egypt, Ptolemy, wanted the Torah translated into Greek, he took 70 scholars and locked them in 70 different rooms, didn't tell them why he was doing so, and then in each one he said, "I want you to translate your Torah to Greek." He didn't want them to be together because they might decide to make some changes, and he wanted to get the authentic product. And so therefore he separated them, and they didn't know what they were there for. Nonetheless, the Chachamim, with divine spirit, made certain changes, and one of them is the very first verse. They changed it to read Elokim bara Breishit, which means God created the beginning. Because otherwise, if you look at it literally, it almost sounds like it's saying Bereshit, at the beginning, created God. In other words, there is something, Bereshit, that created God, that God has created. God forbid, we could never say such a thing. And so the rabbis switched it so that Ptolemy, who may not have been the sharpest nail in the box, wouldn't get the wrong impression. But that raises another question. Why indeed does the Torah phrase it in a way that could be so misleading? Let the Torah say, like the rabbis translated, Elokim bara Bereshit, God created the beginning. So here is the essence. This physical world is not a physical world. It is a spiritual world with physical manifestation. The human being, according to the great Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, has 3 elements to it. One is our nefesh, our physical soul, which we have in common with the animal kingdom, the power to move, to eat, to do anything that relates to the body. Then we have, at the other extreme, the neshama, the spirit, which thinks in the abstract, thinks of philosophy, thinks of poetry, thinks of things that have nothing to do with our physical existence. That we have exclusively, that animals do not have. And then we have in the middle the power of speech. Speech is the battlefield between the spirit and the body. When the Torah says in this week's parsha that when God created man and breathed into him the spirit of life, and he became nefesh chaya, a living soul, the Onkelos, the Aramaic translation, is ruach memalala, a speaking spirit. In other words, what sets man apart is not his intellect alone, but it is his power of speech. And Rav Chaim of Volozhin says, therefore, the person who uses their speech for base and physical things, they lower their entire value to that of animals. But if a person uses their speech to elevate themselves and speak of spiritual things, then they rise up and become closer to God. And so therefore the power of speech symbolizes the spiritual potential in everything that is physical. And perhaps that is implied why God created the world through the power of speech, to teach us that this physical world is not just a physical world. It is a physical world. It is a spiritual world with a physical manifestation. And through our power of speech, if you look through the rest of the Torah, everything that happens starts with somebody saying something. Even Cain and Abel. Cain says to Abel, his brother, and then kills him. Everything starts with speech, and everything can then turn into physical things depending on which way the speech directs it. Is it good speech or is it bad speech? So therefore the world was created with speech to teach us that this world is a spiritual world with a physical manifestation, but it is up to us to determine whether it goes up or it goes down. And so therefore, when the Torah says, Breishit bara Elokim, the rabbis say, why indeed phrase it in such a difficult way that could be so misinterpreted? Rather, we must look at that first word, Breishit. What does that word Breishit mean? It means literally at the beginning. But it could also mean Bishvil Reshit, because of, or for something which is called Reshit. In other words, this is telling us not when or how the world was created, but why. And therefore the rabbis say, Torah is called Reshit. The world was created for Torah. Israel is called Breishit, or Yesharim. Rashi says Yesharim, which means straight, the honest people. But there are other versions which say Israel is called Breishit, Reshit Tevuato, the first of his crops. So therefore the world was created for Israel. And if you read through the stories of the book of Genesis, they are there to show the spiritual colors of the Jewish people. And therefore, what Rav Yitzchak is saying is that God created the world, which is a physical thing, but it is a spiritual thing, with physical manifestations. And each land has its unique spiritual qualities. And the people of Israel are spiritually matched to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. And that's what he means. To say to the nations of the world, it's not like we're taking somebody else's land. They don't belong there. Spiritually, it is not for them. They have another home. But we belong there spiritually. And you know something? History, in a sense, proves this, because Mark Twain, the famous American author of the 19th century, in his book Innocents Abroad, talks about his travels, and one of the places he came to visit is here, the land of Israel. And he describes a land that is barren, desolate, a shadow of its former self. All of the glory seems to have disappeared. A very sad and bleak description. When we read it today and we go out and we look at the trees, at the parks, at the mountains, at the beautiful growth, the flowers, we say to ourselves, Mark Twain seems to have gotten to the wrong place. It looks like he's describing the moon. But yet he was here. What's the difference between then and now? Very simple. Between then and now, the Jewish people have returned and are returning to their land. And there's a verse in the prophets, Ve'atem harei Yisrael, and you, O mountains of Israel, an peichem titnu, bring forth your branches, ufrichem tis'u, and lift up your fruits, le'ami Yisrael, to my people Israel, ki kerevu lavo, because they are coming close to home. They are coming back. They will be here soon. In other words, Rav Yitzchak is teaching us that the land of Israel has unique spiritual qualities that connect deeply and inseparably from the spiritual qualities of the people of Israel as we see them develop and grow throughout the book of Genesis. Let us remember to use our power of speech to enhance those unique spiritual qualities, and may we have health and peace in our land.